from Women's Federation for World Peace Korea, and I'm an MC for today's symposium.
세계평화여성연합과 유엔 한국협회는
Today's
한반도의 영구적인
symposium
평화와
is
번영을 위한
co-hosted by
방안으로
Women's
유엔
Federation for
국제기구
World Peace
유치와
Korea
DMZ의
and United
평화적
Nations
공간
Association
활용을
Republic of Korea.
제안하였습니다. 그리고
And
두
the two
기관은
nations have
2021년
proposed
MOU를
the
맺고 전국 주요
hosting
지역에서
of the
DMZ
UN
피스존
International
심포지엄을
Agency and the peaceful
개최하여
use of DMZ for permanent peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, and signed an MOU in 2021 and held the first DMZ Peace Zone Symposium in major regions across the nation to discuss peaceful utilization of DMZ. And following last year's symposium, this year's DMZ Peace Zone International Symposium has also been arranged, and thank you for your participation despite your busy schedule. And let me also thank online participants who are joining us on YouTube, especially those from overseas, for your keen interest in peace on the Korean Peninsula. The symposium will begin soon, so please take your seat. And please put your mobile phone on vibrate throughout the event. Thank you. Now, let us open the DMZ Peace Zone International Symposium, co-hosted by Women's Federation for World Peace and United Nations Association Republic of Korea, and sponsored by the Ministry of the Interior and Safety and Ministry of Unification, with a big round of applause. Now let us pledge allegiance to the nation first. Please rise and face the national flag in the front. Pledge. Let us pledge to the flag. I pledge in front of proud 태극기 allegiance to the Republic of Korea for the eternal glory of the country, liberty, and justice. Please put your hand
다음은
back down.
애국가 제창이
And I'd
있겠습니다.
like to invite you to
애국가는
sing the
마스크를
first
착용하신
verse
채로
of national anthem
1절만
of the
부르겠습니다.
ROK with your mask on.
다음은 호국 영령과 순국
Now we
선열들에
ask
대한
we pay
문명이
a silent
있겠습니다.
tribute to the spirit of
문명.
patriots of our country. Salute.
바로 모두 자리에
please
앉아주시기
take your seat.
바랍니다. 다음은 내외 귀빈
Allow me
소개
to
시간입니다.
introduce VIPs.
오늘 심포지엄에 참석해 주신
Although we
모든
are honored
분들이
to be with
귀빈이시지만
distinguished
대표적인 몇
guests who are
분만
attending
소개해 드리는
today, we
점
are not
양해
able to
부탁드립니다.
introduce everyone,
인사드릴
and because
때마다
of the time
힘찬 박수로
constraint, we ask for your
맞아주시면
understanding.
감사드리겠습니다.
When I introduce the
먼저
VIPs,
유엔
please welcome them with a
한국협회
big hand.
이호진
First, we
회장님
have
참석해
Ho-Jin
주셨습니다.
Lee, the
큰
acting
박수
president of
부탁드립니다.
the UNARK.
네, 다음으로는
We
오늘
have
기조 강연을 해주실
Dr.
손기웅
Gi-Woong,
한국평화협력연구원
President of the Korea
원장님
Institute for
참석해
Peace and
주셨습니다.
Cooperation, who will give a keynote speech shortly.
심포지엄의 좌장을
We
맡아주실
have
선문대학교
Dr.
명예교수이신
Heung-Soon Park,
박흥순 교수님
Professor
참석해 주셨습니다.
Emeritus at Somun University, who will be moderating the symposium.
오늘 발제를 맡아주신
Next, we have Dr. Myung-Sub, lawyer of the law firm Hanmi, and today's presenter.
역시 오늘 발제를 맡아주신
We have
이승호
Dr.
박사님을
Seung-Ho Lee, who
소개해드리겠습니다.
stays
현재
in the
미국에
US
거주하시면서
and
DMZ 포럼
chairs the
회장을
DMZ
맡고 계십니다.
Forum.
오늘은
He is joining us online.
참여하시는데요. 지금 박사님께서 계신 뉴욕은 새벽 1시가
It's over 1 a.m. in New York, so I appreciate your participation in the very early morning in your time zone.
역시 오늘 심포지엄을 위해 해외에서
We have another guest from overseas. We have Dr. Anna Gritting, who is joining us online. She is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Environmental Diplomacy and Security, University of Vermont. She is joining us from Geneva, Switzerland. Please give her a big hand.
네, 오늘 이 행사를 주최한 세계평화 여성연합
The host for today's forum,
회장님 소개해드립니다.
we have Dr. Julia Moon, International President, and Ms. Young-Sun Choi, President of Women's Federation for World Peace Korea. Thank you.
오늘 이 자리에 대면 비대면으로
Lastly, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for the peace and unification of the Korean Peninsula. Please let us give us a big hand. Thank you. Let me move on to the welcoming remarks. The welcoming remarks will be given by Dr. Julia Moon from the WFWP.
Distinguished guests and the members of Peace, I am the introduced Julia Moon. Thank you for joining us today out of your busy schedule. Thank you very much for joining us today. We support peace, and especially I'd like to thank our guests from abroad to support peace. Thank you. In June, we held a symposium, and it's been 3 months today with a new theme, and we are here to hold this new symposium. Women's Federation supports Korean Peninsula peace in DMZ and world peace as well. We suggested to host UN organizations, and in this regard, starting from last year, we have co-hosted symposiums with UN associations ROK to discuss feasibility to host UN international organizations in DMZ and also about the peaceful use of DMZ. Especially today, we will talk about overseas conflict cases. We will discuss its implications on DMZ, and we will also understand some opinions and insights from overseas, in and outside Korea. It will be a good opportunity for us to understand a lot of different opinions on DMZ and world peace and peace on the Korean Peninsula as well. Distinguished guests, the Russian-Ukrainian war has become a very long-term world crisis threatening the entire world, and Russian President Putin has also started its military draft for 300,000 people, and we can see a lot of exodus from Russia. And he also talked about the possibility of using nuclear weapon, which is threatening the entire world. North Korea has also launched several missiles. It has also passed a law enshrining the right to automatically use nuclear weapons to protect itself, which is also a threat not only to the Korean Peninsula but also to the entire Northeast Asian countries and world peace as well. Peace, defense, security, and economic security, their impact is not a problem of one country, it is a global problem. As we speak, it is a really important time for all of us to discuss to realize sustainable and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula by gathering our wisdom. Distinguished guests from home and abroad, today we see a lot of people concerning about growing conflict. And now, of course, I know that it is not easy to talk about how to host international organizations and DMZ. However, everyone knows that from our history, we have experienced a lot of conflict and war based on nationalism and power, and they are not acceptable. This is what everyone agrees in the world. That is why I believe it is very realistic and feasible for us to have to host an international organization in DMZ. So far, we have seen a lot of symposiums on the theme of, for example, peace on the peninsula, to enhance our understanding on the UN and many other international organizations. And so far, the theme has garnered a lot of attention from the politics, which is very meaningful. Today, we need to explore some pragmatic and visible activities and effort to host a UN international organization in DMZ based on what we have discussed last time. UN Association Republic of Korea has set its agenda, including hosting a UN organization in DMZ. Hosting an international organization cannot be done by a single institute, and it is not something that we can achieve in a short term. Therefore, mid and long-term roadmap is very important, and it is also important to attain the attention and interest from the governments and also UN members as well. So the participation of the governments and UN members are very important. To this end, we need specialized studies, research, and policy development in and outside Korea. Women's Federation deeply agrees with the cause supported by UN Association ROK, and we will explore more ways to realize those goals and targets to move forward. Distinguished guests from home and abroad, I want to invite all of you in this room to our sacred effort to realize permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula and unification to write a new history. In particular, we have members from Women's Federation Overseas Offices and global citizens who support peace on the Korean Peninsula. I want to ask all of you to give us more support and attention. Lastly, I want to thank President Ho-Jin and keynote speaker Gi-Woong and Dr. Myung-Sub. And also, we have Dr. Seung-Ho and Dr. Anna Kretching, and our moderator as well, Dr. Heung-Soon Park. Thank you, everyone. I hope today's discussion and speech can give us a lot of insights and good ideas. This ends my speech. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Julia Moon.
다음은 인사말의 순서입니다. 인사말은
Next, let us invite the speech of encouragement.
회장님을 단상으로 모실
Let us invite
부탁드립니다.
President Lee Ho-Jin.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Julia Moon, as well as members of the Women's Federation for World Peace International and distinguished guests. I would like to thank you all for your active participation. I'm really glad that we hold today's symposium. So since this symposium is an international symposium, as Dr. Julia pointed out in her remarks, so she briefly discussed what was discussed in the last symposium, but I think since today's symposium is an international symposium, I would like to give greeting remarks in English for our participants from abroad. I ask for your understanding. As introduced, my name is Ho-Jin, an ambassador and the acting president of UNAROK.
Perhaps I may repeat what I have said last time. Some very good point in Korean I did. So today I'd like to make my remarks in English. Dr. Julia Moon, President of Women's Federation for World Peace, and distinguished members of WFWP, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is really my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all again to today's DMZ Peace Zone International Symposium. DMZ Peace Zone Symposium, jointly hosted by WFWP and the UN Association of the Republic of Korea, has gained importance to seek permanent peace on Korean Peninsula while the international situation is dramatically, very rapidly changing and transforming. As you are well aware, the WFWP has mounted a very important campaign to attract the 5th United Nations Office to Korea for peace on the Korean Peninsula. My organization, UNAROK, United Nations Association of Korea, has also come up with a campaign strategy for making presence in Korea of a sort of UN cluster for peace and development. I see that the two organizations have come to clearly recognize the need to jointly promote the campaign in alliance. Now I have to say the momentum on our campaign has gained traction with the change of the government in Korea last May. I strongly believe that the current Yoon administration will be enthusiastic, very interested in our campaign, perhaps recognizing the campaign as a powerful tool to bring durable peace on the Korean Peninsula. We can achieve practical results when we proceed this project alongside with the government as medium to long-term plan. To translate this vision into reality, firstly, UNAROK is ready to soon start our strategic consultation, strategic discussion with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. Attracting a UN organization to Korea is not a matter that can be easily determined by the government alone. It would take some time, starting from shaping up convincing and realistic rationale to making multi-thronged effort, including all court-pressing diplomacy by governmental as well as non-governmental organizations for achieving this noble goal eventually. In one way or another, it is very important to augment the support of key relevant stakeholders like neighboring countries, China, North Korea, Japan as well, and to maximize possible benefit to everyone, every country. Going through this process, the consensus to be built through cooperation and support of international civil societies and by the UN community will finally allow Korea to reach that goal. From the UNARK perspective, the first option of task would be building up international solidarity with all UN associations of countries through close consultation and joint campaigns. Further, based on this solidarity, each UNA in international community will be encouraged to drive support from their government, which will be a robust groundwork to pave the way for the UN General Assembly to successfully adopt the resolution to this end. Now, a question is, why a UN cluster embracing the dual mission of peace and development as two noble missions of the UN to be set up in Korea? My argument is that, as you know, the UN Peacebuilding Commission, PBC, was established in 2005, recognizing that the UN need to better respond to the challenges of peacebuilding, particularly in post-conflict situations. Peacebuilding Fund has been in place as the organization's financial instrument, and the Peacebuilding Support Office was established in the UN headquarters. And yet, they are very small and limited in terms of their staff and finance and their functions. I remember, for example, Japanese delegation in a relevant PBC meeting in the past once raised an idea of PBC's institution building, but they failed with the microscopic approach. However, UNARK believes that Korea, being in a right position, has ample rationale for the PBC's institution building or institutionalizations. Among the three main pillars of UN mission, integrated approach to peace as well as development has high feasibility and greater synergistic effect. In fact, the PBC review process 2020 also emphasized the importance of this approach. In various fora, UN has tried to promote post-conflict peacebuilding as one of the top policy initiatives for development. Perhaps up to a point that this approach has gained wide-ranging approval and wide-ranging support in the whole UN community. In a nutshell, I must say, Korea is the most eligible location for attracting the large or small UN organizations addressing peace as well as development together. A case in point must be Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. As we know of it, that is one of the greatest achievements of the 8th UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. It behooves us to gradually enhance development support for North Korea under the UN framework, while Korea is expanding and strengthening support for development of many post-conflict countries. In addition, besides this tangible benefit, it will help to improve the relations between South and North Korea. If a UN office in the form of Peace and Development Cluster is established near the DMZ, for example, when addressing the North Korea's economic development, North Korea may show positive response without tension. Pyongyang's trust they have toward the UN will be enhanced through physical easy access and through regular participation in those meetings to be held nearby, such as in DMZ or other places in Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, in any event, like today, when it comes to DMZ Peace Zone Symposium, I'd like to pay high respect to the leadership of the Women's Federation for World Peace, especially Dr. Julia Moon, for her profound yearning for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Indeed, this symposium has provided us so far with unique opportunities as well as valuable venue to put forward creative ideas to promote enduring peace, not the fragile peace on the Korean Peninsula. In this regard, today's symposium, I'm sure, will be another milestone to shorten the long journey for consolidating the peace on the peninsula and eventually leading to the peaceful unification of divided Korea. Finally, I'd like to confirm the UNARK's commitment to working together with the World Federation for World Peace on our common agenda for world peace and prosperity of all humankind. Once again, I would appreciate all of you for your great support and honest contribution. This sense of unity on core values we share together makes us one of the most trusted partners. Thank you very much for your attention.
귀한 인사 말씀해 주신
Thank you for your speech, President Lee. Next, we will invite the keynote speaker to this theme as conflict management cases and international disputes and DMZ on the Korean Peninsula. And I think this theme is really related to German unification. And we have President Gi-Woong of Korea Institute for Peace and Cooperation. Please give him a big hand. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I want to thank Dr. Julia Moon for having me, and thank you for your very good words, President Ho-Jin Lee. And I also want to thank Dr. Myung-Sub, who's supporting human rights, and also Dr. Anna-Grating. Good to see you again, and Dr. Seung-Ho Lee, thank you for joining us today. Are you a Korean? Do you really believe you are a Korean? If you visit DMZ and if you see that it is the most northern part, then that means you are just a South Korean, not Korean. You can visit the DMZ, and if you think that this is the center of Northeast Asia, then you are a Korean. National security, according to the Constitution, we can see that the national security covers the entire Korean Peninsula, so it depends on the scope of the DMZ that would determine if you are a Korean or a South Korean. And I made my decision to really support a Korean Peninsula unification after visiting Germany. And many Koreans actually still say that Germany cannot be our case because we are different. But I firmly believe that Korea can learn a lot from Germany's case. Peace unification is the core part of our constitution. There are three rationale behind my opinions. First, Germany realized peaceful unification and unification into a liberal democracy. Germany has suffered a lot, but after unification in politics, military, and economy, it has become integrated a lot than before. It is stronger than before, despite all the difficulties. Based on the three reasons and rationales, I believe we can learn a lot from Germany. But there's one significant difference, which is North Korea has nuclear weapons, but still we can learn a lot of insights from Germany. I started the research in 1998 on DMZ. So this is the reality of the DMZ border area in the southern part because of the division from many parts of the society. DMZ is actually a victim of division. The development has not been done in this area, and at the same time, it is also a perpetrator of division. As tensions grow, the DMZ border area has contributed to the tension. And we can also see the residents in the area, or the border area itself can also be seen as a perpetrator of division. But I firmly believe that it can be a good opportunity based on our effort, our citizens' effort and government effort. First, we can talk about the future of the DMZ and border areas. We can make it a vanguard of overcoming division. In the northern part, we have Kumgang Mountain, and Kaesong industrial conflict, but it cannot ultimately contribute to a Korean Peninsula peace because it is very vulnerable to political situations. We can simultaneously utilize northern part and southern part of DMZ. And inside DMZ, in the northern and southern part, we can start a cooperation project fully utilizing the DMZ border areas. That way, I believe we can realize unification. We can build some industrial complex in Paju and also in the southern part and northern part at the same time. This is an ideal picture. That way, DMZ border area can become a vanguard of overcoming division. And second part, I believe that it can become the vanguard of North-South integration. When we realized unification, why do we want a unification? One of the biggest reasons is because we want to visit North Korea very freely. A free interaction and free passing. And those are living in the border area will be the first who would visit the other side of the peninsula. So their integration will determine the entire integration of the Korean peninsula. In the process of the integration, the border area and the residents there should be the vanguard of North-South integration. But from today's perspective, first of all, becoming vanguard of overcoming division and becoming vanguard of North-South integration is not very realistic way to achieve, because we cannot expect any positive response from North Korea. There can be some military tension and many difficulties, but we can first make the border area as a show window of our effort. We can first work on the southern part of DMZ. We can make a lot of effort to make sure that from the cultural perspective, we can make the DMZ a very cool area for North Korean residents and many people in the region and the world as well. The southern part of DMZ can become a really good cultural park. Distinguished guests, I visited several times the German borderline. The borderline between China, North Korea, and Russia, the length is about 1,400, and the German borderline is also about 1,400 kilometers. They have a lot of military facilities. The purpose is to prevent any resident from escaping the one part of the nation for freedom. This is a automatic mine. It has 3 layers, which means it shoots anyone that would pass the border. Right after the unification, the deadly border area turned into a line of life, which was led by a lot of organizations. These are the motto of the movement. For example, borderlines make division, nature creates connection. And as a result, the borderline has become an eco-centric park. It has about more than 30 sites for parks, museums, and many other facilities as well. On the left side, you can see the ocean, and you can also see mountain. In order to protect the environment, German people make a lot of effort, and they also utilizes many different vehicles, like bicycles, to cross the border to protect the environment and interact with each other at the same time. You can see many different natural trees and mountains. And when I visited there, I met Saman, who actually worked there for a long time, and we talked to each other for a long time. These are passing points. You can see many different passing points. The areas for U.S. force and German force. And the left side, you can see those small rivers, small streams, and with the stream at the center for the 4 decades, there were 2 villages that were divided into 2. I also wrote my book, and for 64 weeks, I wrote some articles about the German unification and DMZ as well. I studied DMZ and German unification. The borderline in Germany used to be the line of death. But after the fall of Berlin Wall, the government made a lot of effort to make it a peaceable area. However, before unification, Germany didn't really have any idea and any preparation on how to peacefully use the area, but we are making that effort. I visited the border area, the long 1,400 kilometer borderline. I visited the long borderline.
지금 여기서 말씀하신 제5 사무 유엔 제5 사무국과 같은 여하튼
But they didn't really have any kind of preparation. They didn't have any kind of idea to achieve peace, environmental protection on the near the borderline. They didn't have any idea. They just built some museum, and there are some visitors, but there are not many visitors. But we can do that. We can learn some lessons from the Germany case, and we can start a big project in DMZ. That is, when I published my book in 2000, I said we can host a UN environmental organization in DMZ. At the time, we had a discussion with government officials and the government as well. And at the time, I said we have many problems, for example, nuclear weapon. But as for the environment protection, this is something that we can do right now together. And I firmly believe that the environmental issue is very, very serious. The air pollution is a very serious issue. Can you imagine North Korea? When North Korea started its economic development, we will have an even more serious economic problem. And I was told that is it realistic to develop DMZ as when we are in front of the nuclear weapon threat? In 2013, we had a new government, right? So right before that, I published another book, which is called Peaceful Unification of the DMZ as a National Strategy. I said peacefully utilizing DMZ should be a national strategy. And this is the outline of my book in 2012. The Kaesong Industrial Complex in Keungang Mountain is mainly about the exchanges and cooperation for division management. There have been a lot of exchanges, but they didn't really know about each other, about the other side's economic situation. And I would say the Kaesong Industrial Complex is the cooperation for division management. But what we should support and pursue is unification-oriented exchanges and cooperation. Second, the border area. When we develop the border area, we should consider many different aspects, including political, military, economic, social, cultural, and environmental, and international situations. Third, I have served as an advisory member for the DMZ development. We have been told a lot about the eco park of the DMZ, but the problem is that it's been government-centric. What's important is to have the government at the center. And we should make the project a global project. That way we can achieve stability, peace, and unification as well. And lastly, what's the most important is that the ecosystem of DMZ should be protected and development should be limited.
지금 개성공단 같은 경우에
The Kaesong Industrial Complex,
1제곱킬로미터. 봉해선 같은 경우에 150m.
it's a big land.
1제곱킬로미터 안 되는 그 범위에
We need to make
군사적으로 별 문제 없고
in the smaller area than the complex. In DMZ, we need to make it as an ecocentric border area. We should not make it larger to protect the environment. We should not make it as larger as Kaesong Industrial Complex.
DMZ 사업을 할 때 어느 지역을
When we proceed with DMZ projects, we need support from North Korea, and we also need some cooperation from neighboring countries, including China and the US. In Paju, my idea is that
6.25 전쟁에 참여했던 모든 국가
all the countries who participated in the Korean War,
89개 국가
about 80 countries, can participate in the project. From our southern side, we can invite those who supported us, and on the northern side, we can have those who supported North Korea during the war. And by gathering them together, we can create a cultural area where everyone can talk about peace together, peace and culture together.
그래서 처음에 북한이 공화하지 않는다면 우리 측에서부터
If we cannot earn any positive response from North Korea, South Korea can start first. We can build a performance stage, and we can show many different traditional food from many different countries to show, to enhance cultural exchange.
이것의 가장 큰 작은 축소판이라고
Park Geun-hye administration's World Peace Park is very similar to this idea, and I also worked on that project as well.
두 번째가
Secondly,
있는 개성공단 더 이상 안 된다. 남북관계 개선
we also need to have a industrial
어느 상황에서
complex on the southern side of the DMZ. Only having the Kaesong Industrial Complex on the northern side is not enough. We need to go hand in hand together. We need a
파주가 조응이 된다면 이 철원은
co.
쪽 철원이
We need
있어가지고
a
철이 조응이 되는
two different complexes that can be developed together, Paju and Kaesong together. And Paju can support Kaesong complex. On DMZ,
연결했는데
I suggested to have the gas pipeline,
옛날 구소련으로부터 서독 또는 서방
and
공급이 전혀
we also have gas pipelines from Russia to Germany, right? But during the Russian-Ukrainian war, we also saw that Russia is utilizing the pipeline as a weapon, right? That's what I didn't really expect. And as for military side, if you imagine the shape of Bukhan River, it's a long river, and it is important from the military side. And I suggest that we can make the region as a UNESCO protection area, as UNESCO Transboundary Biosphere Reserve. The lake can be utilized peacefully from the cultural perspective. If you visit there, please refer to the picture on the screen. We can make a lot of seats right here
바로 저기서 공중의 무대
on the northern side and the southern side as well. And we can also build a cultural performance stage
국군사 본계선을 넘어서
so that everyone can enjoy performance on the lake. And residents, especially from South Korea, can visit and can see some
영상까지 가서 공연 북한의 교회를 공연할 필요 없이
some trees and mountains on the northern part. So North Korean performance team can perform on the stage for South Korean residents.
그는 왼쪽 산으로 보던 남북한의 군사적 통제를
And on the DMZ, we can also have
유엔 환경기구
UN Environment Organization and DMZ UN Peace University.
북쪽 고성 지역에는 별관은
In Goseong, on the northern side,
왜 이걸 생각했냐면
we can have another building for
보존을 해야 되고
the organization,
개발했기 때문에
and the main building can be built on the DMZ.
거점 지역으로 만들 그런 부산 속에서
So this is also one of my ideas about peaceful use of DMZ. Yangyang, Sokcho, Goseong, all these areas can be utilized for
근데 저는
to protect the ecosystem of the region from 2018.
저는 DMZ 평화적 이용에 이제까지 실현은 안 된 그 가장 큰 주요 이유 중
I
하나가
believe
정말
there are many different reasons behind why we didn't make any progress about the peaceful use of DMZ. First of all, this is a rosy picture for us, rosy future for us, but it is not acceptable for North Korea. We can build some soccer playgrounds,
우리보다 우월한 점이
right?
휴전선이 서울에 가깝기 때문에 거기에 그들의
But for North Korea,
서울을 불바다를 만들 수 있는
what they believe they can beat South Korea
넓은 지역 보험 만들고
is that they
전부 평화적 이용하자. 그건 북한이
have the military base near the border. But we are saying that we can make the demilitarized zone and making it a peace zone, which is undermining
경제적으로 사회 문화 환경적으로
North Korea's military strength near the border area. That means our
더구나 또 DMZ는
idea to peacefully use DMZ is not actually a good idea for North Korea. And the idea should also be supported by neighboring countries, including China and the US. But with sanctions against North Korea,
설립을 생각하고 있습니다.
our previous idea is not feasible. That is why I came up with the DMZ UN Peace University, this new idea. And we have worked together to build this university. But considering this situation with the strong sanctions against North Korea,
자양분으로서 이 안을 한번
I believe the university can be a really, really good idea to support our future effort for unification. DMZ is the area is the symbol of conflict, but we can build a peace education institute in
93명을 보내고
this area.
사과정하고
193 UN members can send their students to the university in the world.
돈안 내는 사람이 있겠습니까?
I believe those rich people can
북쪽 지역
contribute some funds to the university. North Korea can provide us with some fund for the university, and I also believe that President Yoon Suk-yeol can also support us for his term for 5 years. He can serve as the president of the university. He can play an important role for the university, and Kim Yo-jong can also do her part for the university. That's my idea, and
위원소에 사무를 가는 그 과정에서 평화대학교를 한번 고려해 주시고
and the Peace University can be a really, really good groundwork for our unification. Recently, I'm launching a movement, and I also built this
5년 8월 15일이 광복일이
I built it by myself.
10만이 사람 대한민국 국민 아니에요.
Actually, Korea celebrates the August 15 independence, but we should not, because it is not something that we should celebrate, because that day was the start of division of the Korean Peninsula. We should be very shameful of the history. That is why I voted by myself. Last year marked 75th year of division, and in order to honor that long time and those 75 years, I made my effort for the monument. I originally wanted to build it near this building, which is at the center of Seoul, but I couldn't because the Sejong Square is honoring our heroes. That's what the authority said, rejecting my idea. But my idea was to build this monument at the center of Seoul, but I failed. I was rejected, and I also tried many things, but I was rejected, and I need your support. From November, from Baekneungdo to Goseong, I want to build this monument for unification in 10 different areas. So you can see the slide. Look, our people, Koreans. And I was told that the monument can become a negative sign for North Korea. That is why I changed the signs. And on the observatory, South Koreans can actually see North Korean villages there, and on those observatories, 10 observatories, my idea is to build the monument, and please support my idea. We also have a new movie. I'm not sure if you are aware, Dr. King, when he died, many people became very sad, and that's when we heard the If I Can Dream by Elvis Presley. Let's realize unification. Thank you. Thank you for your very passionate speech. Thank you. Before we start our speech and discussion, we will have short break time. Those for the guests online, please wait for 10 minutes, about 10 minutes. We will meet 3:10.
네, 이제 본격적으로 DMZ 피스 존 국제
We will start
신문위원회
the speech and discussion
발표를
for
시작하도록
DMZ
하겠습니다.
Keystone
이번
International Symposium. The theme today is Conflict Management Cases in International Disputes and DMZ on the Korean Peninsula.
본 심포지엄의 좌장은 앞서 소개해드린
We have our moderator, Dr.
좌장을 맡으신
Park Heung-Soon.
교수님은 미국
He earned his doctor's degree in international relations at University of South Carolina. He served as a member of Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and UNESCO Executive Committee. He is now serving as the Vice President of one of our co-hosts, UN Association Republic of Korea, and also Honorary Professor of Sunmun University. He is indeed one of the best experts in UN and other international organizations in Korea.
행사는 한국뿐 아니라 앞서 소개해드린 것처럼
As explained before, we have special guests from the US and Europe joining us today online. Let us invite them to the stage via the screen in front of you. Please bear with us as there can be some delay when the internet connection is unstable. Thank you for your understanding.
발표자분들이 발표하실 때는 객석에 계신 분들께서
And please use your interpretation receiver as the speakers will speak in English.
그럼 박흥순 교수님과
Let us
발제를 해주신
invite
이승호 박사님 그리고 안나그리
Dr.
단상으로
Park
모실 때
Heung-Sook,
큰 박수로
Dr.
맞이해주십시오.
Myung-Sub, and Dr. Seung-Ho and Dr. Anna Grading. Good afternoon. I am Park Heung-Soon.
만나뵙게 돼서 반갑고요.
I'm glad to meet you all today.
우리가 아는 바와 같이 오늘은
Today, we are gathered here for the DMZ Peace Zone International Symposium co-hosted by Women's Federation for World Peace Korea and United Nations Association Republic of Korea.
제 심포지움의 규모로 성격으로 이렇게
As it is an
하게 되었습니다.
it is an international symposium
이 커다란
which is
행사에
very meaningful, and I'm honored to serve as a moderator for you today.
바쁘신 와중에도
I want to send my gratitude to our members and all the guests who are joining us today out of busy schedule. And I also want to thank
두 기관의
the two
문 회장님과 우리 이호진
WFWP and UNA Korea. Thank you. And we also have special guests from abroad.
저희 한국에서 통일운동에
We have Dr.
하고 계신 우리 숨기훈 원장님이 지금
Seung-Gi-Woong, who is a strong supporter for unification. As he provided us the keynote speech, he is studying German unification and also ways for unification on the Korean Peninsula, and he delivered many great ideas on Korean unification and lessons from German case.
통일법제에 대해서 제일 정통하고
And we also have an expert in human rights in North Korea and their law, their unification movements. A lot of research is now being done by Dr. Myung-Sub, and we also have distinguished Dr. Seung-Ho Lee, who is president of DMZ Forum,
또 제네바의
and we also have Dr. Anna Grading, who is living now in Geneva, and she will provide us with some European perspective on the Korean DMZ peace and unification. It is indeed an international symposium with great experts in and outside Korea. I believe that is why the symposium is very meaningful and special. This is an international symposium, so I will speak in Korean, but if it's necessary, I will also speak in English.
이미 두 회장님께서
Dr. Julia Moon and
지속 가능한
Dr. Lee Ho-Jin,
우리의 캠페인에 대해서
President Lee Ho-Jin, talked really good ideas and insights about peace and Korean Peninsula unification. And it's time for us to discuss some of the conflict cases, Cyprus and German's cases,
적경 지역 관리를 성공적으로
Grunesbant
하고 있는
case.
그런 독일의 사례. 이런
So we will take a look at many different cases outside Korea, which will,
관찰을
I believe, provide us with a lot of insights for Korean unification based on the
우리 한반도의
discussion, and
시사점이
we can learn a lot of lessons and
진행을 할
insights. That would be our focus today.
세 분의 전문가가
So the three speakers, three experts, will give us some speech, 20 minutes each.
부탁을 드리고 그 다음에
Next up,
총정지를 비롯한
we will invite the audience and on and offline
지뢰를 중심으로 해서
to have a Q&A session to answer your questions,
듣고 배우는 그런
to
기회를 갖도록
learn more
해서
about our future vision. And I deeply hope that the symposium can provide a good opportunity for you to have more understanding about your unification movement and peace on the Korean Peninsula, to strengthen our determination for Korean Peninsula peace. And the Yoon Suk-yeol administration last week, the president visited the UN and delivered the keynote speech, and I believe some of you have paid attention to that speech. This was the 77th UN General Assembly, and that day marks UN International Peace Day. He delivered a really great speech, but one thing that I feel regrettable is that there was no single word about the DMZ peace or Korean peace. And anything about peace on the Korean Peninsula. It was a 11-minute speech, which is very short because everyone is given 15 minutes, and Biden delivered 30-minute speech, and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan delivered 20-minute speech, but President Yoon Suk-yeol only spent 11 minutes. It was very regrettable because he had more time to talk more about the Korean Peninsula, peace on the Korean Peninsula, also North Korean residents, and it was very regrettable for me. And next year we can have today we can have very meaningful discussion. And moving forward, we can also send more materials and based on our discussion today to the government authorities, and the efforts of the hosts today can also be better presented to the government. That's what I hope and what I expect from the government. Today is the last day of September, but internationally we have many different events happening. The international situation, the global situation is changing very fast. And this morning, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un also test-launched a missile. Despite that, despite the difficult situation, we are supporting and pursuing peaceful unification. To that end, we need to keep moving forward for our campaign and vision. That is why I believe this symposium is very important. And let us invite the first speaker, Dr. Myung-Sub, to hear about his insights and his experience. He is a lawyer, but at the same time, about the law of unification, he is an expert. He has visited the Cyprus, and he's well aware of the situation there, and he can compare the situation there and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. That's what he studied, and he also published a book on the comparison. So regarding the case of the division of Cyprus and DMZ on the Korean Peninsula, he will show us some comparison. So he will spend 20 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your introduction. Since I have only so much time, I would like to introduce Cyprus very briefly, and then I will move on to the issue of DMZ, especially the comparison of DMZs between Korea and Cyprus. So this is the scene from Cyprus, and actually this is me walking on the shore. And let me show you the map. I think in English it's pronounced Cyprus, but in Korean it's pronounced Cyprus. So on the right side you can see pictures, and actually the picture I showed you earlier shows the same ocean from this picture. And actually most of the Greeks lived on the shores of this part, and this is how this country looks now. The Republic of Cyprus is its official name, and on the northern Cyprus it's the Cyprus or the Northern Cyprus, and they use two different flags. The first one is the Turkish one, and the second one is the Greek Cyprus flag. So just like we call North and South Korea the Korean Peninsula in its entirety, the Cypriots call their country Cyprus, even though it is composed of the two Cyprus. And so the northern Cyprus was occupied by the Turks, and the southern one was occupied by the Greek. However, as for the northern Cyprus, it is not recognized by the international community except for Turkey. I think that there is some similarity with North Korea and South Korea situation. And also, just like the Berlin War, this country is divided, and Nicosia is the capital of the country, which is divided by this wall. And some say that Korea is the only remaining divided country on earth. But actually, the concept of the divided nation has to do with the division that took place because of the difference in ideologies since the Cold War. That is why Korea is called the only remaining divided country on earth. And these two countries, our two countries are trying to achieve unification. Maybe things might be different according to the government. However, at any rate, the government have tried to achieve unification. But I think Cyprus, in terms of the unification efforts that they are making, it has the most commonalities with Korea compared to other divided nations. So when I look at the history of Cyprus, it was occupied by various countries, and it is also visited by a lot of Christians, because it was a place where the Christianity was propagated, and also it suffered the occupation by Ottoman forces, and that's when the Turkish people started to reside there. However, they were not in large numbers, and the country was also governed by the UK before it achieved independence later on. And on time of independence, about 80% of the residents were Greek. However, they were occupied by the Turkish people. So the Greek, looking at the situation in Cyprus, decided to pursue the so-called Enosis movement in order to unite the country with Greece. However, Turkey did not like it, because in the past, the Turkish people who lived in Cyprus were also driven out of their country in the past. So, looking at the Enosis movement of Greek, Turkey also tried to intervene. So, the UK, Turkey, and Greece, these three countries signed an agreement to guarantee the independence of Cyprus. So in the 1960s, Cyprus achieved independence, and the constitution says that there is about 8:2 ratio of Greek to Turkish people. So, however, according to the constitution, more authority or power was given to Turkey. For example, some government positions were given to Turkey, such as the head of the bank, something like that. So people thought, okay, with that constitution, people seemed to blend together. However, there was a President Macarius III who tried to amend the constitution in order to take away the power that was given to Turkish Cypriots. However, the Turkish Cypriots responded negatively to that, so it led to the conflict between the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. And in 1963, there was some issue between the two residents, and there was an outbreak of bloodshed. So the UN ended up deploying the UN peacekeeping forces. Back then, about 6,000 soldiers were deployed to the city. So the capital, which was Nicosia, was where these forces were deployed. So this city came under the management of the UN peacekeeping forces. However, that couldn't prevent the conflict in the country. So there was a coup in 1937. And those who were in charge of the coup tried to unite the country with Greece. However, Turkey protested that, and they tried to invite the UK to intervene. However, the UK was hesitant, so Turkey ended up sending their forces to Cyprus. So there was a short-term war in the country, and about 35% of the territories were occupied by the Turkish forces, and it led to the division of the country. So the UN got intervened and decided to create something that was similar to demilitarization. So when the division happened, this is the map about that division. So the red spots are the settlements for Turkish Cypriots, and the blue spots were for Greek Cypriots. However, after the war, the combinations of the settlements ended because they had to flee. So the Greek Cypriots went to the northern part, while the Turkish Cypriots went to the Turkish Cypriots went to the northern part, and the vice versa for the Greek Cypriots. And in the middle, there is some buffer zone, and there's a country called Pyla. So, at any rate, the residents are divided according to this map. And this island is actually quite small. It's smaller than Korea's Gyeonggi province. And there are some graffitis, like the photos on the slide, that symbolize the unification of the two countries. At any rate, there was a high-level agreement made and a draft framework agreement for unification signed, and also Annan Plan, which had to do with the UN intervention, was also drawn and proposed, and the UN tried to intervene with its peacekeeping forces. So in 2004, the Annan Plan, which was a sort of unification agreement, was proposed. It's about 9,000 pages, so it is very long. So why is it so long? It's because it has to do with the establishment of a new Republic of Cyprus. So it contains everything about constitution and the establishment of a new republic. That is why this agreement or this treaty was so long. I think Korea would need such a long treaty in order to achieve unification. At any rate, this Annan Plan was accepted in the referendum in the northern part. However, it was rejected in the referendum in the southern part. So after the rejection, the southern Cyprus joined the EU right away. So the southern part is quite open. So if the northern Cyprus residents came to southern Cyprus, they can even issue their own passport and uses this to travel around the EU. I kind of envy their situation. So there are several implications and key issues for Cyprus reunification. For example, their territorial adjustment. And for example, depending on the form of unification, if the Greek Cypriots came back to their old settlement, then they might be able to reoccupy their property. Also, at the moment, Turkey is trying to join the EU as much as possible, so it is trying to intervene in the issues of Cyprus legally as well. Also, there is an issue of the freedom of residence and movement. Just like South and North Korea worry about the freedom of residence when the reunification comes, Cyprus is encountering a similar issue. However, it's a little bit different. For example, if Greek Cypriots come to the northern part and live there, then they might occupy the whole area, even erasing the identity of the Turkish Cypriots. That's what some of the Cypriots are worried about. Therefore, Cyprus is trying to restrict the freedom of residence to some extent, according to the Annan Plan. And also, there is an issue of British and Turkish forces. There are some British forces in Cyprus, so there are two cities. Actually, those two cities are British. It's not like the British forces are just deployed there. It's actually the British forces. And also there would be an issue of cost of reunification. So on this map, the green part shows a buffer zone, and the gray part shows the land owned by the UK. In other words, this country is composed of four parts: the UK forces land, the buffer zone, and the northern Cyprus land, and the southern Cyprus land. I think the Korean Peninsula is also composed of four parts. So the pictures here show the buffer zone sign as well as the UN forces base. So this line, the buffer zone line, is quite long and it's winding. And in 2004, as I said, the referendum rejected the Annan Plan, and the southern Cyprus joined the EU right away. And after that, the southern Cyprus started to open up and open their crossings. Before that, the crossings were blocked. So starting with Nicosia, there are about 9 corridors or crossings that were opened. So there is something called Redra Palace and Redra Street. So it's like a town, so you can cross there by foot, and crossing by car is not allowed. And Redra Street is in the outskirts of Nicosia. You can also cross it by foot. And there are some parts where crossing by foot and car are both allowed. At any rate, these 9 points, 9 crossings are open 24/7, and nobody asks for their permit. They can just scan their passport and then cross. In other words, the free movement is allowed. So earlier on the map, I showed you this map, and there are 4 towns in the buffer zone, and one of them is Paila. So the Paila is a village inside the buffer zone, and the picture here shows the center of the village. Why is this village so famous? It's because it is home to both Turkish and Greek Cypriots. Even though they live together here, they have their own schools and they have their own government offices, so they are all separated, even though they live together in the same village. The restaurants are separated as well, and they have their own police offices. So these 2 pictures show village head office for Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. And these are the pictures of police stations as well as the civil affairs building. So there is a patrol going on. And about 890 officers are patrolling there. In other words, it's not the size of the forces that is protecting this land. So this is the Redra Street in the center of the Nicosia. So people are showing their passport to cross the checkpoint, and people can cross by foot and by car. So in the Redra Palace, there are 2 checkpoints for northern and southern Cyprus, and there are various events and UN meetings held in this area. And this picture shows the area on the Redra Street where crossing by foot is allowed. It's a very small area. So, and it's very winding, so if you cross this line, you can encounter a lot of checkpoints. And the Cypriots from the north and from the south, they even commute using this corridor. And sometimes they can even cross without showing the passport to the police officer. Let me compare the 2 countries. So this is the core part of my presentation. First of all, the Korean DMZ was established in 1953, whereas the Cyprus one was established in 1974 under the UN Security Council resolution. And the size and the length are different as well. For example, the Cyprus buffer zone is about 184 kilometers in length, and it's 7.4 kilometers in width. And the land size for Korean DMZ is about 992 square kilometers, but I think it's declined recently. And the Cyprus buffer zone is quite smaller than Korea DMZ. And the biggest difference between the 2 DMZs is that actually the DMZ in Cyprus is a single DMZ, whereas Korea's DMZ is quite divided between the north and the south. The north and the south are opposing on the DMZ, so they are pointing their guns at each other, whereas in Cyprus, the UN peacekeeping forces, who are a kind of third party in the country, are there to manage the DMZ. In other words, our DMZ is not technically a buffer zone. And earlier we heard the presentation about the peace park in DMZ and the Korean War and the different life that has unfolded due to the Korean War. At any rate, the armistice agreement on the Korean Peninsula was purely military purposes. It was for retaining armistice between the two countries. However, in Cyprus, the armistice agreement or the buffer zone aims to achieve the military purposes as well as the return to law and order and the return to normal conditions. That's the difference between the two countries. So we think about ideas of building schools and universities in the DMZ. However, in terms of legal issues, we always encounter this issue. At the moment, the UN Forces Command only gave us the executive power. In other words, we need a permit from the UN forces to do something about the DMZ because, as I said earlier, the armistice agreement in Korea's DMZ aimed to achieve military purposes. So if North or South Korea are hesitant to do something about the DMZ, then they can cite this armistice agreement. So for the entry to the DMZ, the permit is required. However, in Cyprus, you don't need a permit. And there is a university in Cyprus. And except for that, except for the village within the buffer zone, the UN peacekeeping forces need to give a permit to access and to allow access. And also there is a farmland in Korea's DMZ. And also there are a lot of mines in both Cyprus and Korea, and I'm not sure who has more mines, but at the moment in Cyprus, UN mine action services are working to remove those mines. I envy that too. And also, as I said earlier, we are limited in our activities about the DMZ because of the armistice agreement. However, the peacekeeping forces of the UN who are stationed in Cyprus aimed to achieve return to normal. That's the difference between the two countries. So what they are doing there is to protect the residents and keeping peace. So this proposal might sound absurd, but I think that we have come up with a board proposal for the DMZ in the north and the south, but our proposal is mainly about supporting economically North Korea in case they give up their nuclear weapons. However, I don't think that will work actually, because North Korea might not even want financial support from the South if it's not the support from the international community, and such financial support would not be enough to feed all the North Korean residents, and also they need to deal with their human rights issue as well. I think the critical issue for North Korea is the security guarantee. And even though we try to address that issue in our peace talks and we try to sign a lot of agreements, the problem is North Korea couldn't believe that we will guarantee their security. So our proposal is that so at the moment we are opposing each other on the DMZ. I propose that the UN, which is a third party, should come in and sort of sit there, which would be more powerful than signing an agreement between North and South Korea. And if the UN comes in, then North Korea would expect that the US would not come in. And also, on our end, we wouldn't expect North Korean forces to cross the line where the UN is stationed. So I think we need to make these we need to make the changes to these physical situations as well. Without those changes, a peace agreement would not work. Promising security guarantee with the peace agreement, I don't think that can buy North Korea. So since 2016, a lot of laws or regulations have been passed by the US government regarding the nuclear issue and everything. And the US, what the US is trying to do is basically not lifting any sanctions unless the North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. So I shared my proposal, and I think I came to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Han. Thank you for your great speech. Thank you for keeping the time under 20 minutes. So you have seen all the pictures that he took by himself, and he also gave us a lot of interesting ideas. And I also thought I very envy them because they can cross the border very freely, and they experienced war, but they are today enjoying peace. And today, the UN is playing an important role between them. Secretary General Kofi Annan, her plan. She has a plan, and there have been a lot of intervention by the UN. And what's even more surprising is that many things, all the decisions have been made by the residents by themselves. Of course, we can talk about it later on the discussion session, and I believe I also expect the North Korean authority to change by itself, to pay more attention to German case and many other unification cases. And they need to make sure that residents in North Korea can speak up. And that is what I have felt very impressive from the Cyprus case and his study and research. The UN interventions have been made. I wonder if it was the request from the residents, or it was just the decision from the top leaders of the UN. That's what I want to ask. And secondly, UNPQ, I am the expert in that area, PKO. I am the expert of PKO. You might be aware of PKO. Basically, in 14 countries, conflict zones, PKOs are operating there. Basically, it is demilitarized, and they don't really take any side. They try to stop conflicts. Of course, there are many more activities these days, and the dispatchment to PKOs is actually different from the UN force on the Korean Peninsula. The characteristics between the two are different. And the UN force in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, and the PKO are different. The UN force on the Korean Peninsula manages the division and also play a role to prevent conflict between the two. They play two different roles, but basically PKO and the UN force in the Korean Peninsula, they have different roles. And I believe what his idea is very interesting. As you're well aware, in order to create an PKO, 5 countries of UN Security Council should agree. the creation of PKO in the region means they are getting a lot of support from the UN, and that is why the creation of PKO is very interesting. Thank you.
그러면 이승호 박사님이신데
Let us invite Dr. Seung-Ho Lee.
Dr. Lee Seung-Ho. He is currently residing in New York and affiliated with the New York University, the Graduate School of Public Service, and he was a senior researcher at that university. He is PhD from State University of New York, Albany in political science. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Lee Seung-Ho for his presentation. You have about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parr, for the kind introduction. I'm so glad and honored to join this important symposium dealing with a very crucial and timely subject. So for the presentation, I'd like to move to my PowerPoint slides. So today I'd like to talk about managing conflicts and building peace through the Korean DMZ. I'll focus on Korean DMZ from the US Global Strategic View and the Acheson line. Why US Global Strategic View? The United States and Soviet Union emerged as a global superpowers for the first time in 1945 by defeating fascism in both Europe and Asia. So it began, unfortunately, worldwide Cold War between democracy and communism along the 38th parallel on the Korean Peninsula. So here, from the US Global Strategic View after World War II, Korea was seen as sort of peripheral state. The US views Korea somewhat like a land of the morning calm, not a core state. But in early 20th century, Korean Peninsula has a very strong development of Christianity. Because Pyongyang was once called Jerusalem of the East, and Wonsan is compared to Rome of the East. That is stark contrast of Chinese communism and Japanese fascism in the same era. So I think for the reunification of the two Koreas, religious significance is very important. The role of religious leaders should be emphasized. So we'll talk about that sometime later. So at this time, unfortunately, the US President Truman made a major mistake of withdrawing his troops from South Korea. It's out of political naivety because Soviet Union maintained over 3,000 military advisory personnel and lots of war armaments in North Korea. As you see, US withdrawal of its soldiers, around 40,000 soldiers. The complete withdrawal was made in June 1949. So unfortunately, a similar number of US soldiers killed during the Korean War. Actually, the United States made another mistake by Secretary of State Dean Acheson at the National Press Club speech in early January 1950. He made a great and detailed emphasis on the Japanese security, while not mentioning South Korea at all, in delineating the US defense line. In the speech, it is called defensive perimeter, in containing the communist threats from Soviet Union and China. In the original text, the United States had the necessity of assuming the military defense of Japan in the interest of Japanese security. Whatever arrangements had to be made, either through permanent settlement worldwide that defense must and shall be maintained. The defensive perimeter runs along the oceans to Japan and then goes to Ryukyus and to the Philippine Islands. So far as the military security of other areas in the Pacific is concerned, it must be clear that no person can guarantee these areas against military attack. So this Atchison line clearly indicated the line that the US military will focus for its military security from the attack of potentially Soviet Union and China. So Kim Il-sung and Stalin interpreted the speech as they wished and invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1953. Actually, the invasion was made with official agreements and strong personal assurances from Stalin and Mao. Stalin at the time was 72 years old. Mao was 57 and Kim Il-sung was 37. Actually, Stalin played a role of a literally big brother. So Stalin handled all the war process, and many observers say that the armistice process that lasted 2 years, actually North Korea and China settled earlier, but the armistice process lasted due to Stalin's objection. So in March 1953, when Stalin died, the armistice process proceeded. So anyway, the war was not just a civil war in between Korean nationals, but became an international war that lasted until the present. There are several important aspects in the Korean War. I guess number one is the nuclear aspects. Actually, the United States considered formally nuclear attacks against North Korea and China in late 1950. And later, the war enemies developed nuclear weapons. Soviet Union and China in 1964, and North Korea in 2017. Another aspect is interesting is Stalin supplied lots of tanks and warplanes to North Korea during the Korean War. But ironically now, Putin is asking for North Korean armaments, rockets and artillery for its Ukraine war. Very ironical situation. Another aspect is a huge casualties of soldiers from all corners of the world. 16 United Nations forces joined the Korean War. So I think the 16 United Nations should play a crucial role in ending the war and building the peace of the Korean Peninsula. As you know, the Korean War, however, did not end. Instead, Korean DMZ was created by the armistice in July 1953. So now it lasted near 70 years of this DMZ. South Koreans view the DMZ as an accidental paradise for endangered animals and rare plants, and also potential site for peace park and a war memorial. And almost all the South Korean presidents since 1990s, regardless of liberal or conservative governments, opposed to turn the DMZ into a peace park. Especially President Park Geun-hye spoke at the US Congress about the subject in 2013, and President Moon Jae-in made a speech at the United Nations in 2019. And then the southern half of the DMZ is under United Nations command supervision. It is headed by US Army General, currently General Paul McNamara, who has two other roles in South Korea as commander for US forces in Korea and the ROK US Combined Forces Command. And the US government, regardless of liberal or conservative, have never made any official response in public. to the DMZ peace proposals. North Korea, on the other hand, controlling the northern half of the Korean DMZ, denounced such South Korean proposals as nonsensical ones because they say in Korean war still goes on. So this is a North Korean view, a symbol of US imperialism and national disgrace, and a dark reality of division. And North Korea maintained the goal of liberation of South Korea and sought the Korean unification only in between Korean nationals. And they defied 1953 armistice by expelling Poland and Czechoslovakia from NNSC and turned the northern half of the Korean DMZ heavily militarized zone with thousands of underground long-range artilleries. They can make the Seoul metro area with more than 20 million people a sea of fire within a few hours, even without missiles. Actually, they threatened like that. What about the US view on the Korean DMZ? As I told you, they have not provided any official view in public on the DMZ, despite numerous South Korean governments and US and South Korean NGOs' proposals to turn the DMZ into an international peace park, just like the DMZ Forum did for the last 25 years in the US. Interestingly, the US actually is not interested in the DMZ as an area, as a zone. They're only concerned about the military demarcation line in the middle of the DMZ as a defense line. The US views the Korean DMZ as just a line. They have no interest in how the DMZ's nature has changed. Actually, US considers somehow the MDL here as sort of second US adjacent line from here to here. So the northern half of the DMZ is very thin buffer zone for the US. In the southern half of the DMZ and the South Korea is on the US defense line, the second adjacent line, under Armistice Agreement and Mutual Defense Treaty between the South Korea and the United States. So for the next 40 years, there's Cold War. Until in 1991, the demise of the Soviet Union, the MDL was played a role of defense line. It's an unimaginable military provocation by North Korea. As you all know, there's a Blue House raid by North Korean commanders. And USS Peveril Navy ship was attacked and captured, one dead, 82 soldiers imprisoned. And the US Navy aircraft shut down and killing 31 soldiers by North Korean MiG-21. And as you well know, the two US Army officers were ex-murdered by North Korean soldiers. In this period, the US endured a lot to maintain the status quo of the MDL that was crucial for the US global strategic interest in Northeast Asia, defending US interests from Russia and China, potentially North Korea. Now, the next 30 years have changed a lot. End of the Cold War and post-Cold War era until this year, 2022. Lots of political arrangements differed from previous era. So South Korea and Russia diplomatic ties, and South Korea, China's diplomatic ties achieved, then isolate North Korea. There were also a number of inter-Korean summits. Also recently, there were 2 US DPRK summits, but no major outcome was made. No deal was made. And it only clarified the emerging DPRK nuclear ICBM threats. So this year, recently, North Korea declared itself as an unofficial nuclear weapon state. And they want to be viewed as a normal state. On the other hand, South Korea became a cultural and economic global superpower, actually becomes a core state from a peripheral one 75 years ago. So until now, still, the maintaining the status quo of the MDL, that is strategic patience policy, maybe 2.0, so far seems good for the US global strategic interest of defending democracy and economic opportunities in North Asia. But the second phase of the Cold War began. That's a new Cold War era because of especially Russia and Ukraine war began in early 2022. So Russia, China, and North Korea alliance and US, Japan, South Korea alliance strengthened a lot in this new Cold War structure. And many experts and observers now acknowledge that 30-year negotiations of North Korean denuclearization has failed, unfortunately. And every year, they are now looking at North Korean nuclear weapons. Now, dozens of them will increase and soon reach to hundreds of them. There is totally different matter that become uncontrollable threat to the US and the world. Now, the reasonable question and thinking is keeping the status quo of the MDL strategic patience still useful for the US global strategy interest if US cannot control the increasing number of North Korean nuclear weapons with ICBMs targeting US continent? That's a big question. So now let's analyze further. What's the impact of keeping the status quo strategic patience for more years, 5 years or 10 years, with a military buildup of two sides? What's the impact? I don't think there is any further harm to North Korea with its near Cold War structure of strengthening relations with Russia and China. But there is a more potential harm to the United States. The strategic patience 2.0 simply giving DPRK more time to increase the number of nuclear weapons with ICBMs and potentially proliferate them to the Middle East and even to terrorist groups, potentially. But that could be an imminent threat, security threat to the US. This is a big issue. Now, can the US make a unilateral military attack against North Korea, including a decapitation operation for the complete denuclearization of North Korea, without incurring destructions, unimaginable destruction in North Asia, even in the US? Let's consider the recent legalization of DPRK nuclear weapons use that was pronounced recently. Now, another option, can the further US economic sanctions that has been done for the last 30 years or more, and further sanctions, whatever it is, can achieve a complete DPRK denuclearization? I think it's very doubtful, especially the new relations with Russia and DPRK. Then is there any other way? Is there any other way to stop, develop more nuclear weapons? If not, isn't it about time for the US to seriously consider ending the status quo of MDL that has remained for the last nearly 70 years? Then the problem is how? How to end the status quo that has remained for the last 70 years? So I like to propose the idea, sort of different angle. Many talk about creating DMZ peace zone, but I'd like to propose, especially the US government, creating a DMZ peace zone as sort of third US, not just a line, defense line. So in order to do that, there's a four parties role here: US role, IAEA, South Korea, and United Nations. Most important is US role. US, first of all, should establish diplomatic ties with DPRK, making DPRK a sort of buffer state for the US in containing communist threats from Russia and China. So putting a wedge in between Russia and North Korea, putting a wedge in between China and North Korea. Many specialists know that the relationship between North Korea and China has not been so good. There's a lot of chance US can put a wedge between these communist bloc of a new Cold War structure. I think this is a very brilliant, creative idea, how to handle current situation. Through this development, the IAEA can conduct a fully transparent management first of DPRK nuclear weapons, and importantly, holds the future nuclear developments. Very important. And then execute a complete denuclearization. I think it's possible when situation changes, as North Korean leader said recently. Also, South Korean role is very important as a cultural and economic global superpower. South Korea should promote a global strategic goal around the world, defending freedom and democracy worldwide, hand in hand with the United States. Very important, alongside with the United States. And the United Nations role is, I think, very important, very imminent. So UN member states, especially that joined the Korean War, the 16 nations, and except the United States in this case, and there are UN member states, around 158 member states that have diplomatic ties with both North and South Korea. Out of total 193 is a lot of member states who can push the idea of this peace zone, DMZ peace zone idea, so that they united can push the US government at the UN, or directly to the Biden administration or the next administration, to consider establishing a DMZ peace zone and push the US government for US DPRK diplomatic ties. That will help bring a wedge in the communist bloc in this new era of the Cold War. I hope that everybody will share the ideas and promote more creative ideas of resolving these important matters on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.
네, 이 박사님 감사합니다. Thank you for your interesting presentation. 여러분들이 들으신 바와 같이 이승호 박사님은
As you heard,
미국에
Dr.
거주하는
Lee,
시민단체 입장에서
he is the
현재 그
president
미국의 한반도 정책 DMZ에 관한 어떤 인식에서
he is the president of the DMZ Forum USA, and he talked about the Atchison Line. And at the time, according to the Atchison Line, South Korea was not included in the defense strategy of the US, and North DPRK misinterpreted it as a sign that the US would not intervene even if DPRK strikes on South Korea. And he believes that the US still believes that DMZ is the second Atchison line, is trying to maintain the status quo And from the military side and economic side, it is trying to contain and provide some limitations for North Korea, putting some sanctions on it. But he says it's time for us to change the approach to utilize North Korea as a buffer zone. And that way, North Korea can also be satisfied to build a peace on the Korean Peninsula. Very interesting idea and very interesting approach. And I actually have, personally, I have different idea.
The United States maintained a sort of strategic policy, maintaining the MDG and Korean Peninsula problem as a part of maintaining status quo on the Korean Peninsula as a part of American foreign policy. But I believe that approval of the North Korean regime with the normalization, with the diplomatic initiative, as you suggested by the U.S. government, may give the wrong signal on the North Korean regime, because as you know, that Korea, South Korea and United States wants North Korea first denuclearization first, then normalization or economic assistance from the world. North Korea just want to establishment of the diplomatic rapprochement with the United States first, before they denuclearize the weapons. So that basic approach is quite opposite. So it's very difficult to implement your suggestion from the Korean and the United States perspectives. So I think that is debatable. So I would like to hear your view later on after the end of the presentation. Thank you very much again. 다음은 그 마지막 순서인데.
We will invite the last panelist, Dr. Anna Gritting.
I'd like to introduce Anna Gritting from Geneva. She has a very interesting professional background. She's a peace activist, and also she's an architect, urban planning specialist, as well as professor and musician. She is a PhD from Harvard University and actively engaged in many world projects, especially regarding DMZ and border areas. Anna Gritting, I know that you have a lot of things to say, but you have such a good experience with the Korean DMZ and many DMZ and border area studies around the world. But I'd like you to make about a 25-minute speech, and then we'll come back if is there any other suggestions or questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Gritting for the symposium. Please.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Park, for this very nice introduction. And it was a pleasure to meet you in Seoul not very long ago. And also Dr. Julia Moon, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. It's a great honor. Thank you to Women's Federation for World Peace. I'm also very happy to find colleagues, Dr. Seung-Ho Lee and Gi-Woong Sung, whom I've met years ago in Korea and in the US. So it's wonderful to be with you colleagues today. So I will begin my presentation and talking about boundaryscapes and future scenarios for the Korean demilitarized zone, also looking at other examples, and the presentations today really set the foundations. Also, we had all the in-depth explanations about the German Green Belt and also the Cyprus case, both cases which I know quite well. I wanted also just to explain the background for my work. This is a book that I've edited with Michelle Zebisch-Knoss, and it's on the social ecology of border landscapes. This is the sort of what we call the socio-ecological approaches for co-creating shared spaces in border landscapes that mark a shift towards human-centered conservation practices in which nature conservation benefits from the inclusion and empowerment of human communities. So I'm just trying to go forward. I think I have a problem with my, oh, there we are. It's working now. Thank you. So it's also this shift that we see from the ego to the eco, where man is not at the top of the pyramid, but we're actually part of the ecosystem. So I think we're increasingly talking about this in the way we think and the way we plan and design. It's also more nature-based and earth-centric. When we talk, it's from human-centric to earth-centric laws, and we're also seeing this in the legislation. For example, giving rights to rivers and mountains, and there's even an initiative in Korea for this idea to give, the rights to the DMZ as it, as a landscape. Here I talk about eco-diplomacy. With the E in brackets, because it's also about co-diplomacy. So the idea is also about a co-creation, and it's, multi-stakeholder approach, and also not just a human-centered, but with all species. So my work is also very much rooted in women, peace, and environment. In 2004, when I was starting my PhD in Harvard, Wangari Maathai received the Nobel Peace Prize. It's the first time that a peace prize was given and associating peace with the environment. So this was really innovative, and it was Wangari Maathai working with women in Kenya for the reforestation and sort of restoring the environment and also creating livelihoods. And I was very blessed actually to meet her in Boston in 2004. She was giving a talk. And so her work really inspired also what I'm doing. And I think this is a theme that we can see also emerging more and more today: women, peace and environment, women, peace and security at the UN. So I think this is also an interesting theme for this idea that has been mentioned about the 5th UN office, is saying, what kind of office could that be? And my suggestion would really sort of focus on women and environment, that it would have a sort of special focus, and of course youth as well. We mustn't forget the youth, but that it could have also this kind of particular focus. So as I mentioned before, it's also about co-creating peace with nature. So it's using nature as a way to bring people together, the DMZ as a natural haven, but it's also working with nature. So it's using nature to create peace, but it's also working with nature and nature-based design. The idea is also that the process of creating and designing spaces is also an inclusive act of healing, co-creating, and hence reconciliation, through which members on both sides of divided societies work together across old boundaries in a new inclusive space, where the divisive past is not forgotten but surmounted. So it's also about recognizing the past. And so I also talk about this sort of idea of the landscape of memory, how the DMZ becomes a landscape of memory. So as I mentioned earlier, there is, some initiatives, and this is Her Excellency Kum Sil Kang, the former Minister of Justice, because she has this idea. She's the Executive Director of People for Earth, and she suggests that the Korean demilitarized zone could be granted rights just as rivers, mountains, and forests have been granted legal rights. So it's this idea, as we're saying, this earth-centric approach. So what we're talking about is really a regeneration of ecosystems in the DMZ. So we can see that this has happened quite naturally in this band, which has been protected from human intervention since 1953, has been explained. So really nature has had the opportunity to regenerate. And regeneration is a theme that we are seeing also more and more of these days, because a lot of the work we have to do also as designers and urbanists is actually repairing and regenerating the earth. It's not necessarily building new things, but repairing, regenerating, restoring, rehabilitating, etc. So just below you can see, the DMZ with all the rivers that run across it, with the topography, etc. And this is a sort of conceptual framework that I'd like to also present, where there are different aspects. We saw just in the slide before, we have the flow, so there's rivers flowing, but we also have flyways, birds that fly over. We have, of course, connections, which are transport, etc., roads, the normal connections, which are, of course, interrupted at the moment. But we also have wildlife corridors, as I mentioned, flyways, pathways, or driftways, riparian system, the rivers, the lakes, as I mentioned below, the infrastructure. So these are all these elements that are crossing the DMZ that we have to consider. And for wildlife corridors, as we'll see, sometimes the DMZ is actually, a stopping place for, for example, the migratory cranes. Then it's also the linear, the backbone, the structure. So it's a buffer zone, a military infrastructure, and usually these military infrastructures have patrol paths as well. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it's become a sort of habitat corridor, because this is where, nature has been able to develop itself. Excuse me. Then we have what we can call cores or nodes. And these can be like biodiversity hotspots or core areas. When we look at ecosystem ecology, we also have core areas, buffer areas. So these are core biodiversity areas or hotspots. Also, we can have settlements, then we can have cultural hotspots, memorial hotspots, archaeological hotspots along the DMZ. And then we also can have actually punctual events or ephemeral events. So these are events that can happen, that they can be temporary, but they can also then help to build the long-term vision. So they can be commemorative events or cultural, educational events. And we'll see a few examples afterwards. So I also mentioned, the multi-stakeholder approach. This is one mapping that I had started to do with a project we were working on with the Women's Federation for World Peace, a space for women, peace and environment in the DMZ. So here the idea was really, how would we engage with women also from North Korea, then of course the international NGOs, the governments, the regional partners, also the neutral nations. As you may know, the Swiss are part of the neutral nations in the DMZ. I've actually visited their offices and spaces there and made a presentation to them. So it's interesting to see what can their role be. And also Switzerland and Geneva maybe has an interesting position, because we're a neutral nation. We also have the UN. We have representatives actually of North Korea to the UN in Geneva. So it's also interesting to see how, this kind of space could be interesting in developing projects. So this is just a sort of start of a stakeholder mapping, but it's really important, of course, to do these stakeholder mappings and to see the people involved. This is a map I designed for my PhD, and I like to cite Robert Schumann, Borders Are the Scars of History. So this was a mapping of the historical, lines, walls, buffer zones, and in orange, those that were being built or emerging. And you can see obviously the Roman limes, for example, that used to be, all surrounding the Mediterranean, also the Atlantic Wall. But this is to say that, the idea of this map is to say that in the long view, all walls will eventually fall. And when they fall, they become the sort of scars of history. And the idea in my work, one of the pieces I wrote is from a deep wound to a beautiful scar. It's a chapter on my work on Cyprus, which I'm happy to share with you, but I'm not going to go into too much detail today because I don't have time. But this is the idea behind this work that I developed in Cyprus. You can see here the sort of military mapping. So here you see the military sectors and the crossing points, the checkpoints. And then the mapping that I did of the landscape and the rivers. Here you can see the rivers. You can see the sort of national protected areas or forests, and then the buffer zone. So there you see the opportunity of this buffer zone as a connector of different existing protected areas, green areas, and also the way it's kind of crossed by all these, riparian system. The idea is how we transform the military buffer, the disconnection of communities, but that's preserving nature, into a landscape of memory and a laboratory of ecological planning and human reconciliation. So we're reconnecting the histories, the ecosystems, and the communities. And it also looks at this idea of the buffer, because a military buffer is something that separates. On the other hand, it does protect, and let nature flourish. An environmental buffer, because we use the concept also in ecology, it protects resources and biodiversity. And actually, when we're talking about computer science, the buffer memory is actually a place of storage, and it stores memory. So it's this idea of also the buffer as the space of memory. So we're also looking at different scales. We have to take a multi-scalar approach. And here you can see, once again, this map, but you can see from the left, the parcels of the walled city of Nicosia, which I'd sort of drawn and mapped out. Then you can see the walled city of Nicosia, which is divided by this green buffer zone. Then you can see the metropolitan area of Nicosia, the rural districts, the whole buffer zone, then, sort of the national kind of scale between North and South Cyprus, and then also the regional scale. And of course, we heard earlier of the guarantor powers of Turkey and Greece, and then of course also the British, who still have military bases in Cyprus. The regional approach is also not just obviously political, but also ecological, because the map that you actually see here is a map of endangered species, the monk seals. So the regional approach is important, obviously, both for the ecology and for the politics. So this is the beginning of the sort of some scenarios. As was mentioned earlier, there was this, that the Annan plan and the territorial adjustments, which are mapped below. And the sort of existing checkpoints. Of course, now there are several others that have been opened. What's interesting to note, though, recently, I made a presentation. I was also looking at kind of refugee camps and buffer zones. And one thing that's actually evolved quite recently is because there's so many migrants crossing this border now from the north that enter the north, they've actually started to put barbed wire. So it's actually, the border is actually becoming harder rather than softer because of all these the problems of migration. It's kind of an entry point into the EU. So at the top, these are some of the scenarios. The Marine Nature Reserve, because this is where the monk seals were identified, and not by scientists, but actually by the military. There's an enclave of the UN, and so this was actually observed by the military. So how the military also becomes kind of, observers of nature, and, which you could call a citizen science. There's these abandoned mines. So it's how do we remediate these mines and create cultural landscapes? There's also a mouflon reserve. These are endangered species which have taken up their residence in abandoned villages. The proposal of organic farming and ecotourism, eco-museums and rare endemic plants. Then the abandoned airport, proposing a solar campus and an international, sort of bilingual international campus, a little bit like the idea of the UN university that you've presented also earlier. The Green Line Heritage Garden in the city of Nicosia, the Garden of Forgiveness, the Museum of Memory, an archaeological village, a Pila bicommunal village, as we heard about it before. So this is a very special kind of bicommunal village that survived the division. The wetland reservoir remediation, and then Varosha, which is a sort of eco-city, eco-park. This is a sort of ghost town. So these are some of the scenarios for Cyprus. As I mentioned, after I went to Cyprus, I visited with Michael Muller. At the time was the special envoy. He was then in Geneva, the head of the UN. He allowed me to visit the buffer zone, and I came with this idea that there might be endangered species in the buffer zone. And following this presentation and idea, the UNDP actually conducted a study of biodiversity in the buffer zone with scientists from North and South Cyprus. And that's how they discovered also, the mouflon. These are the mouflon. It's a sort of a form of sheep that was endangered. The monk seals, as I mentioned, which were sighted here in the marine areas. As we know, the buffer zone extends out into the waters. Also, these fruit bats have been identified in Nicosia, and also turtles that were nesting on the beaches of the ghost town. So these are all endangered and endemic species. So now I'm going to move on, and as I mentioned earlier, we wanted also to highlight the role of youth, women and NGOs in the co-creation of the space, whether it's the DMZ or also in Cyprus. I've worked on different projects and held different workshops, always with youth, also with women, with artists, with scientists, also bringing art and science together, and also working with NGOs. The advantage also of working with NGOs is that as you mentioned, there are, sort of at the moment, it's quite hot, the conflict between North Korea and South Korea. But we always have to be ready for, when there is a possibility of reunification. Excuse me. That's what I learned from Berlin. In Berlin, when the wall fell, kind of people weren't ready, and there was no plan for what to do with that, with a no man's land. And in the middle of the city, it actually more or less disappeared. So there was an opportunity, but there was no plan. So we always have to start building up the plan. And the NGOs also are, as they're outside of politics, as academia, as we're here today with the Women's Federation for World Peace, we can work on these plans sort of outside politics while we wait for the right moment to implement them. It's what I'll later call these pre-reunification strategies. Now I want to highlight, I wasn't here unfortunately, but I know from my colleagues that in 2007, there was actually a meeting of 700 international women leaders, and they went to Mount Kumgang and met also with North Korean women. So there's really a precedent. We know that this is possible, and it has been possible, and we see this work happening. So the idea is, how do we also build on these initiatives? Excuse me, I'll just take a bit of water. So what I want to mention also is, excuse me, transboundary peace parks and this idea of flagship species. So of course we're working with people, with communities, NGOs, women, youth, also because these are sort of, we can say that it's, it's important to involve all the communities, but it's also, as we said, earth-centric and not egocentric. It's not just human-centric, but earth-centric. So it's also about these different species. And as we've seen in these different borders that I mapped out, the US-Mexico fence, the Cyprus Green Line, even in Israel, the wall in Israel or Korea, there are these endangered species that have been identified with these areas. So these flagship species are also very important. This is just an example on the Mexico-US, where parts of it they've also been building a fence. And this American jaguar, these are the mapping of their territories. And it's also important that we can keep the flow and keep these territories open. If we build fences, then we're really going to reduce the territories, and these species will be even more endangered. So really the importance of these flows. There's also something that we talk about more and more today, about regeneration with apex species. So the panther or cheetah is an apex species. I've recently met Linda Tucker, who has a project in South Africa with white lions, and they've actually proved now, you can see the satellite images, they're reintroducing the white lions, buying up land, and you can see that actually where where there's a free range of these territories, that the land actually regenerates. There's another famous example in the Yellowstone Park, and it's kind of how the wolves kind of regenerated also the rivers. So it's really interesting to see how do we actually plan and think of, for example, the DMZ and the regeneration, also with this apex species view. So here I wanted just to talk, we talked about Mount Keumsang, sorry for my pronunciation, and also how, this here you can see also the taiga here, and how the mountains are associated with this culture, with the mountain spirits, and also with the animals. So it's saying that we can also kind of honor this culture because it's part of the ancient Korean culture, which from both north and south, and it's also one that integrates the landscape, the species, and the people. So here we have a mapping of the DMZ with the different species. We've talked about the cranes, the bears, probably the apex species we would see here would probably be the Asiatic black bear. I'm not sure. I don't think there's any tigers there, but the black bear would be an apex species, and it has been identified in what we can see. It's north of the dividing line. We also know that the white-naped and red-crowned cranes are migratory species, and they stop in the DMZ. Now, very briefly, I won't go into details. We've heard about the Iron Curtain green belt, but just to show this map also where we see all the different sort of endemic or endangered species along the green belt. What's interesting with this project, and earlier I talked about NGOs and bottoms-up approaches, is that it was actually initiated, the German part of it, the German green belt, by bird watchers who were living on both sides of the wall. And when the wall came down, they didn't want to kind of see all this wildlife disappear. So they had this idea and then brought it up to the German Bund, which is the organization that implemented it. What was interesting, it was the longest biological inventory in the history of German nature conservation. So below you can just see this map. I won't go into it, but you can imagine actually doing a biological inventory all along the green belt in Germany. Of course, then the idea expanded, but it's just this is just to mention some of the tools and that we can think about also for the DMZ. Obviously, the patrol path is something that all borders have, whether it's the Roman limes, in the past, the Wall of China. The Green Line buffer zone in Cyprus. So the idea is that actually, this is preserved. So this becomes kind of the necklace along which we can build our project. So we preserve this. Here in Germany, you can actually cycle all along the German green belt. And the idea is you can actually cycle all across Europe, all across the Iron Curtain. Now, this was also an idea supported by Mikhail Gorbachev and his Green Cross Fund. The idea was having green shares where you could actually buy shares to finance the project. So these are other kind of ideas. This was, my work started actually in 1989. I was in Berlin when the wall fell. So this was kind of the beginning of my work on borders. Excuse me. And this was the design of my architect's diploma. As I mentioned earlier, in a way it came too late because, when the wall fell, things went very quickly, and all the center of the city all this Potsdamer Platz here was bought up by the multinationals and rebuilt, and you can't see any of the wall anymore, any space. They had to actually put a copper band on the ground because the tourists were going, where is the wall? So my project was actually a sort of ecological landscape, and I also created a canal with bridges. So this was like the stitching. So you could still see, you'd have to cross the water every time. There was a Berlin Wall documentation center. The checkpoints actually became these squares. That's Checkpoint Charlie. So there was a whole program, kind of cultural, ecological, historical program. And this is actually, this was my master's program. This is the whole Berlin Wall as it goes through the center of the city. And you can see how it connects all these different green spaces. So this is the Tiergarten for those of you who know Berlin. So this opportunity as a connector also of existing ecosystems and spaces. And we know that sort of green networks, green connections are very important in ecology. It's not just about creating green spaces, but really connecting and creating networks of green spaces. Now, I just mentioned Mount Gyeongsang, and also the importance of sacred sites. Obviously, these are part of Korean history and the unified history. This is a map, I'm sorry, it's not a very good one, but it shows some of the sacred sites, and I just highlighted those that were kind of near or were in the DMZ. So we have the Manisan Mountain, a shrine of the national heroes, and a temple, and the Treasure Gate Temple on an island. So these are kind of near the DMZ, and also we have the Mount Gyeongsang that we just saw before, the Diamond Mountain, which is a very important symbolic mountain, and actually that's where the Women's Federation for World Peace, held the event with women. So these are also very important in the DMZ. So this is also the joint excavations. I found this information. So that's really important because, this archaeology is part of the common past, and having these joint excavations between North and South is a sort of collaboration outside of politics. We can call it, also science diplomacy or cultural diplomacy. And these are obviously very, very important heritage sites. So environmental peace building is something that I'm also very, very much involved in. And this is a colleague of mine who worked with UNITAR in Geneva. We did our masters and worked together. She actually built this, what's called Green Legacy Hiroshima. And it's a really interesting project because really, what they noticed is that what survived after Hiroshima is some trees, because of course it was a disaster, and, the city and people were wiped out. And so the idea was to keep the seeds of these trees that survived Hiroshima and to send them all over the world to create kind of peace parks. So this idea of how we can also create connections with other, gardens of peace or peace parks or peace movements around the world. So the idea is we could actually get some seedlings and we could create a sort of space garden in the DMZ with these seeds from Hiroshima. So we are actually linking all these peace movements. I mentioned the importance of nature and culture, as you've seen, and how they're connected. I was very lucky to be able to see some dancing cranes when I visited the DMZ with Professor Gi-Woong Kim, whom I was collaborating with, and we published some papers together. And also realizing that the cranes are messengers of God or symbols of communion with God. They're also symbols of longevity, of peace, immortality. Also, one evening, I went to a very traditional restaurant in Korea, and I saw actually this crane dancing. So to see that it's actually reproduced in the traditional Korean dancing. So this is a very powerful message for the DMZ. And I've also worked with the International Crane Foundation. They actually published a chapter in my book on social ecologies, and they're doing really interesting work actually in North Korea. They're actually restoring the landscapes and assisting, for the migratory birds. So this is actually intervening in North Korea. So this is also an interesting bridge, and here you can see the flyways of these birds. And this is a map from their conservation project, where you can see the project areas and the critical crane habitats, which you can see along the sea on the left. I hope you can see that. It's a little bit quite difficult to read here. This was some work we did at Harvard. I actually created with the Korean Student Association. We did a workshop on the DMZ. Many of the students didn't really know much about the DMZ at the time. This was in 2008. It was I would say it was more of a taboo subject. Maybe it wasn't as dressed as much. And we actually invited Professor Kei-Chung Kim. At the time, he was heading the DMZ forum, and he came and gave a talk to the students, and we did a whole lot of mapping of the DMZ. And one of the students, landscape students, was mapping all these wetlands that are along the DMZ, very important landscapes. And Professor Gi-Woong Kim, with whom I worked, also did a lot of research on wetlands. Now, this is just from my Cyprus projects that we developed with students, and just showing how we can, restore these riparian areas, how they can become, spaces also, to welcome obviously the species, the migratory species, but also people. So just some ideas of projects that we've developed. Now, social spaces and businesses are also very important. Small businesses, of course, ecological businesses, but, there has to be the economic factor as well. As we see here, the traditional food is always something that brings people together. Traditional food, of course, Korea is known for its food. I love Korean food. So it's also important to develop these spaces and to highlight all of this. I know that the DMZ rice is actually really well known because the rice grown in the DMZ organically is said to be very, very good rice. And I know that, Koreans really, really like their rice and are very, very, have really good quality rice. Now, this is something that I discussed with Clarins, which is a cosmetics company in France. And one of the ideas for the Women, Peace and Environment, as Korean are also really well known for their cosmetics, is the idea of how we could develop sort of Korean cosmetics and traditional plants in the DMZ. And I met Marie-Hélène Lair at an event in Switzerland. She's the director of sustainable innovation, and she's an ethnobotanist. And she thought this was a really good idea to bring Korean women from North and South together. And she said, creating a garden laboratory with traditional Korean plants and skincare could be a wonderful way to allow Korean women from North and South to share their heritage and knowledge. So this is an idea that we've discussed, and, hopefully we could begin to develop with Korean women from North and South. Arts, music and dance are also very important. The culture, the cultural heritage from both sides. So there's obviously the common heritage from the past, but there's also new kind of trends, the K-pop, and then in the North they have certain, I've tried to do some research on the type of music. So there's kind of the more recent development and then the shared kind of culture. So now we're going to talk a bit more about architecture, urbanism and landscape, which is my field. Just going back to showing how this is the buffer zone in Cyprus. So just mapping out, the possibilities for organic farming and ecotourism in these areas, farmers markets, where the crossing points are, where the checkpoints are. We always have to build these as well with existing infrastructure because we don't want to be building more and more infrastructure in these areas. So these are some interesting projects that I found. Also the Bridge of Peace, this idea of creating bridges as well, so that, we preserve, the landscape. So you could create kind of structures that don't actually touch the ground. This was Jae-Eun Choi, who worked with Shiguru Ban Architects. This is what I mentioned earlier, the Garden of Forgiveness in Cyprus. I was proposing this project that is developed in Beirut. You might know that Beirut had a civil war, was divided into two sides, the city. This was developed by a landscape architect with all the communities and all the different faiths, and really this importance of having the Garden of Forgiveness, because if we want to move on, we have to be able to forgive. Not forget, but really forgive, so that we can create a common future. This was just the images of the copper culture mines. So these were the abandoned mines and how they can then become cultural landscapes and ecological landscapes. Now, this is an interesting project. This was a competition in the DMZ. It was a Korean bathhouse, and the idea was quite interesting, is to keep, there was accesses from both sides of the dividing line. So you kind of keep the memory of the dividing line. You have access, on both sides, which can be either North or South Koreans, but there's also, male, female. So, you can kind of play on these divisions and separations, and it's also underground. So it kind of brings back, this idea of the conflict archaeology, etc. Now, the bicycle path, I mentioned before, we saw the green band. I've also proposed, obviously, in Nicosia. We saw that the UN actually, cycled the patrol path in 2010. We see images in 1964, the Finnish soldiers cycling to Nicosia from Dikelia. And some images from the 1950s at the time, because when I proposed this, there wasn't much cycling, and people were telling me, that this was impossible. But I said, there was in the 50s a lot of people were riding bicycles, and now it's actually coming back. Here I'm looking at the railway stations on both sides of the dividing line, because it's also important to create programs. And, you know, this idea when we were looking to build a space for women, peace and environment, the idea that actually it needs to be accessible for everybody. So, you know, possibly using, you know, existing railway lines and, you know, making these programs and nodes, important spaces connected to public transport. We know-
Excuse
Yes.
me, it's very much behind our schedule. Would
Yeah.
you wind up in a couple of
Okay.
minutes? Yeah, already overdue so much.
I will wind
Yeah?
up. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry for taking so long. I will wind it up. So you mentioned the fifth UN office. I won't go into details about that, but just I just want to talk about conflict heritage, how we can reuse infrastructures and keep them. This was the Swiss neutral nations, also reusing these spaces in the future. How do we keep the memory and reuse the spaces? This is in the Cyprus buffer zone, how they created the Home for Cooperation in the buffer zone by reusing a building. They have these events here with people from North and South. So these are just some, I won't read all these. You have them all in the booklet. So I won't go through all these recommendations and ways that we can move forward. But just to say, this was a famous architect, Giancarlo De Carlo, he's just talking about really the opportunities that we have in these territorial chasms, you know, to create really far-sighted projects for the future. So I'd like to end here, and I do apologize for taking a little bit too much time, and thank you very much for your attention and invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richting. I'm sorry that pressing so much on your presentation, but we have a very limited time. You had a good effort to wind up what you said. 지금 들으신 바와 같이 그리팅 박사는 오늘
As
오후의
you-
세미나
all of you
이
has
심포지움의
heard,
주제인 DMZ의 평화적
She
이용이
is
과연
an
국제사회에서 어떤
expert in
어떻게
our
이루어졌는가의 비교
theme. So
사례를
she has presented us with a lot of
키프로스와
cases, for example, Cyprus and Grunesbant of Germany. She has studied a lot on this theme. That is why, so based on what Mr. Son and Dr. Han presented with us, she also provided us with some more details. Thank you very much for your impressive speech. I'm very sorry to say that we are behind schedule. This is a very typical situation that we face whenever we have some international symposium. It is regrettable not that we cannot have more time with all of you. From our speech, we can see that the DMZ is the result of the division, but we can also peacefully utilize the borderline to strengthen our cooperation and peace as well. But today, the inter-Korean relation and the situation today is actually very difficult to realize the ideal future that was suggested and presented by those cases introduced by her. But we believe that one day we'll be able to do the same thing with the Cyprus and Germany. So we need to discuss ways to better manage the zone to make sure it is not just the zone for division. But we can peacefully utilize DMZ, which will be very great support for our future unification and peace. Do we have any further time? So our end time is 5 p.m. and we have only 2 minutes. Dr. Han, do you have any additional comments for 1 or 2 minutes? And we will definitely invite you to another symposium.
그러면 우리 지금 연결이
I think we can. Now we have Dr. Lee and Dr. Anna Grijing.
about 5 minutes. So I'd like to give just the last chance to say a few words from Dr. Lee Seung-Ho and Anna Grijing. So I promise we'll have another opportunity, but just 안 보여가지고. 오케이.
예. 감사합니다. 제가 지금
Thank you,
새벽
everyone.
4시인데요.
It's 4 a.m.
시작했습니다.
right now in the
그래서
US.
우리 박 교수님은 제가 DMZ 포럼 활동할 때
Professor
한번 뵌
Park,
것 같아요.
I met you
한국에서.
before in
그리고 우리
Korea.
아나 박사도
And Dr. Anna,
10년 전에 제 가슴을
I
찔했던 그 장면들을
can remember
보여줘서 감사해요.
the things that impressed me a lot, all those cases and history. So it was your speech was really impressive for me. I firmly believe that DMZ Peace Zone can be established and we can definitely host international organization in the zone. The Korean Peninsula issue cannot be resolved with the previous status quo traditional approach. I have many friends who are experts in the environmental protection and diplomatic issues as well, especially those diplomatic experts. They believe that the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula has failed. That's their conclusion. But the core part is that what should come first? Denuclearization first and normalization later. This is the basic idea. Then should we maintain the traditional, conventional framework? I asked them, but they didn't actually give me an answer. Of course, it is not really easy to change the previous approach, but my suggestion is that we can rebuild the framework. We can remove the previous framework and we can start from zero, from scratch, to talk about how to utilize DMZ. I am a Korean. I live in the US, but I am a Korean. I see those animals, cranes, and those animals as a Korean. But what we actually see, what other people actually see, those politicians see, is not the animals, but the politics in DMZ. Of course, having passion is important, but the current US government, what is important is how the US government can change their mind, can change their perspective, moving their focus from the defense line to animals in the zone. And the members, UN members, can work together to let more people know the importance of the animals. And we can also build a groundwork for the normalization of the PRK and US. For the US, what's more important is priority and cause and benefit, human rights, terrorism. These are the cause for them to contain the PRK. But as for maintaining MDL, does the US have benefit? I don't think so, because when the PRK is threatening the US with its ICBM, their benefit cannot be maintained and secured. If it continues to be so, Korea and Japan would have more pressure for the development of nuclear weapons in order to make the US make a best choice. We need to push the U.S. to go together with DPRK so that DPRK, China, Russia, their relations can also be considered by all of us. Okay, thank you for your comments.
Dr. Grichting, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I just want to say again how honored I am to be here today and also learning a lot from all the different experts. So it's really important that we have all these different expertise and views on politics, environment, etc. I would just like to maybe highlight that, what is it we can do? As I mentioned, in Berlin, there was no plan. So I think it's really important what we can call pre-reunification strategies from a planning point of view is to say, how do we develop different frameworks and also do the research and science to really study the zone and to make a sort of environmental master plan so that when the time is right, we really have done the work and the science, and also trying to obviously connect as much as possible with North Korea, with scientists, what we call science diplomacy, cultural diplomacy. Another work is, as I mentioned, the landscape of memory. How do we honor all the victims? Because the victims are not just Koreans. In fact, it concerns the whole world, soldiers, journalists, people who've lost, loved ones, Koreans, of course, but also other people. So, doing a lot of work on the missing persons and where would we, where should we commemorate different people? What are the right areas in the DMZ? So there's a lot of work as planners and designers, working with scientists, working with all the specialists. That we can actually already, elaborate what I call these pre-reunification strategies and planning. And I already spoke very much during my presentation, so I don't want to be much longer, but I look forward to continuing to collaborate and also with Women's Federation for World Peace, and hopefully that we can also develop the project starting with a sort of incubator, for women, peace and environment with some of the ideas that I've presented. And
Okay, thank you very much. I believe that your suggestion will be well taken by the Korean community. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you.
네,
감사합니다.
그러면 5분 이상 지체가 됐는데.
So we are 5 minutes behind the schedule. Let's wrap up. As a moderator, I'm really honored to have all of you, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. I want to thank WFWP, UNA Korea, and all the distinguished speakers and guests. Thank you.
네, 국제 분쟁의 사례와 지속 가능한 평화를 위한
Please give our moderator and speakers, Professor Park, Dr. Han, Dr. Lee, Dr. Anna Grichting, who have provided us with a lot of insights on cases of world conflicts, future direction of DMZ for sustainable peace.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
세계평화 연합연합
WFWP and UNA Korea will continue to work together to realize peace and unification on the peninsula. The symposium is especially significant as it tries to earn support not only from inside Korea but also outside it to realize permanent peace and unification on the peninsula. I'd like to ask your further support. That ends the DMZ Peace Zone Symposium. At the send my deepest gratitude to distinguished guests from home and abroad, female leaders, guests joining us online, and last but not least, our guests from abroad for your participation. Thank you.
네, 나가실 때는 통역 수신기는 의자나 책상 위에 두고 가주시면